Okay, so now the question is, how do we combine psychology and Christianity in terms of anthropology? And again, what we're doing is using psychology as an example of how to do this. You can integrate the other sciences with Christianity in similar ways. We're using psychology as an example. So, how do we combine these two? Well, psychology helps us to see the outworking of theology. In other words, how does man act as fallen? How does he act as social? How does he act as functional? How does he act as finite? Um, Now, I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not going to try to explain all the details here, but suffice it to say that observing neurological um, function and observing human behavior can allow us to see how these things happen. And when we say, especially in terms of the fall and being finite, that's especially where psychology can help us, because psychology so often has to do with disorders, with abnormal things, with things that aren't supposed to be that way. And psychology can help us to see, okay, well, this behavior is a product of psychological damage, psychological malfunction, which can be traced then back to the fall. Our bodies deteriorate and we have physical disability sometimes because of the fall. Likewise, deterioration is especially true in terms of us being finite. We're not eternal, we're not infinite. We are made of dust, and we return to dust, and our bodies are fragile and can be harmed and can deteriorate. Uh, Psychology also helps us to observe patterns of relationships, although what we need to be clear about is that just because we observe patterns does not mean that that is then normal or, in biblical terms, righteous, good, etc. And then finally, in terms of function, if our function is to be God's image bearers and to be fruitful and multiply, psychology can help us in terms of, especially that relational aspect of being fruitful and multiplying, both in terms of evangelism and in terms of marital relationships. Psychology can help us to see what problems exist and how to proceed. Now, again, that does not mean that we should take observances from psychology and say that they are therefore good or normal or truth in the positive sense. We need to be careful that when we talk about psychology, we make sure that we are not saying that anything that psychology observes is good, because that's simply not true. Sometimes sociocultural patterns, social function, social relationships, even though it might be considered normal by the culture at large, and even though psychology observes some sort of positive effect on neurological function by behaving that way, that doesn't mean it's good or that it's right. So that's where we have to be careful in combining these two things. We'll talk more about integration next week. So here we've talked about the different options in anthropology. We've talked about psychology, we've talked about theology, and what we've said is Christian theology tells us the why and the how man exists. Psychology then helps us to see the outworking of that in everyday life and in relationships. What we want to do for the rest of our time is dive a little deeper into the biblical and theological teachings on anthropology. I'm not going to dive too deep here. You're reading Anthony Hoekema's book will help you here, and it's very, very detailed. I want to encourage you to read through that thoroughly. It's going to be a lot, and that's why there's not any assignments this week, because Hoekema's book is so very detailed and lengthy. However, you will be benefited by grounding your doctrine of man in the Bible and in theology in the future, whether you're a Christian studies major or psychology major or whatever else you are. You will be benefited in knowing who man is, why he exists, and for what purpose he exists. Okay, so again, here in the lecture, I'm not going to read through the Bible verses Hoekema talks through those at length. I just want to try to summarize what he says so that you won't get bogged down in the details of the book. Right, so first of all, we have biblical teaching on the image of God. Genesis 1:26 through 28. We've already read that. Then we have Genesis 5:1 through 3, and Genesis 5:1 through 3 tells us again about God making man in his likeness, and also that the children of Adam and Eve were also in the image of God. So this is how we sort of relate Adam and Eve to the rest of humanity. The image of God and their sinful nature both passed on to the following generations and to all of us. And then we have Genesis 9:6, which is about Noah. And Genesis 9:6 says, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image." And then verse 7 going on says, "And you be fruitful and multiply, teem on the earth, and multiply it." Now, what this tells us is that life is precious. Shedding blood, murder, is wrong when we know it's wrong in our hearts, in our souls. I mean, you just think about murder, and it's something that everybody recognizes as sinful, and that's because we are inherently imbued with the sense that life is precious. And that's what Genesis 9:6 tells us. And the reason it's precious is because we're created in the image of God. So we don't kill, we don't murder, we don't harm other people because other people are made in the image of God. So these three verses simply indicate to us, first of all, what the image of God is, but then in Genesis 5 and Genesis 9, everybody is made in that image, and therefore everybody should be considered worthwhile, equal, worth something, precious, etc. Okay. Now, he lists a bunch of New Testament verses in the book. I'm not going to go through all of these. Suffice it to say, and this is the main point I want you to get from the New Testament verses, being made in the image of God and living in the image of God now means being like Jesus. Okay, so the New Testament explains that Jesus, especially in Hebrews 1, Jesus and Colossians 1, is the image of God. Jesus is the image of God. And we, as God's image bearers, should look like Jesus, therefore. Okay, so when we think about I need to live in the image of God, or I need to look like God, or I need to behave and act in a way that reflects God, or any of that kind of language, what we're saying essentially is that we need to look and act and behave and think like Jesus, because Jesus is the physical manifestation of God on earth. He is what God looks like. The other thing that Hoekema does in his book is walks through the different options in terms of historical teaching on the image of God. I'm not going to walk through all these. The point that Hoekema wants to make is that the image of God historically has been seen as something that we all have. Now, Bart and Bruner get in an argument over whether or not the image is destroyed at the fall or merely disabled. But historically, the image of God is seen as being in all people. It is affected by sin, but it's not destroyed. And it is functional and social. So that's sort of a summary of this. I'm not going to walk through each of these guys. You can get that from the book. Again, what we want to do in this type of reading is to see what Christians throughout history have said about this particular doctrine. So when we ground our theology, our thinking on something, we want to go to the Bible and we want to say, okay, what does the Bible say? But we also want to be careful and make sure that we go to tradition and say, is this something that has been said throughout church history? Is this something that Christians throughout history have affirmed? And that's simply humility. That's providing a check on our own self-focus in doing theology and reading the Bible. So often when we read the Bible, we say, "Oh, this is what I get out of that," or "This is what I got out of it," or "This is how God's speaking to me." And what looking at the history of a doctrine does is say that this is how we've looked at this particular doctrine in the past, this particular verse, and it provides us with a way to humble ourselves and listen to other people. Now, there are some other issues in anthropology, and the second half of Hokuma's book deals with this. First of all, the nature of sin. The question here is, does sin originate from God? Did God create evil? How did evil enter the world? My 2 cents, and what I would say is that God does not create evil. We aren't told how the serpent comes about in Scripture. That's never addressed. However, it's clear that he has rebelled against God, and that in rebelling against God, he tempts Adam and Eve to sin, and they choose to sin. God does not create evil, nor does he make Adam and Eve sin. However, now sin has affected everything, and God is the only one who can rescue us out of it. A second issue in anthropology is whether or not a person is made up of body and soul, which would be dichotomy, so 2 parts, trichotomy, body, soul, and spirit, or is the person a unity of these 2 things? Now, the reason this is even a question is because, oops, there goes that slideshow problem again. The reason this is an issue is because sometimes Scripture does speak of the person as body and soul. Other times, though, especially there's a verse in 1 Thessalonians that references body, soul, and spirit, and then also Hebrews 4 seems to delineate between soul and spirit. So the question is, are soul and spirit different entities? My personal view is that however the Scriptures speak of a person, it especially speaks of a person as a unity. We are body and soul. Jesus says that whatever enters a man's heart, so his mouth speaks. In other words, what's in our souls and our spirits affects how we then act and behave with our bodies. And this is my personal approach. I don't think that when the Bible says body and soul, or body, soul, and spirit, or soul and spirit, I don't think that these writers are intentionally trying to tell us if there's 2 or 3 parts to a person. I think what they're saying is that the whole person as a unit behaves, thinks, believes, feels as a unit, as a body and soul. Okay, so Hokuma discusses all those options and describes them as well. And then finally, there's the question of freedom. This is the question of free will. Do we have unlimited choices, unlimited options? Can we pick and choose what we want to do and when we want to do it? Or does God have a place in our decision making? And my personal thoughts here are that while we do have choices, those choices are limited in 2 ways. First of all, they're limited simply by the context of the situation. If I'm at Captain D's, I can't get a hamburger. I don't know, maybe Captain D's does sell hamburgers now, but anyway, the point is, if I'm in a restaurant and they don't serve a certain type of food, I can't just say, I want this type of food, and it happened. My choices are limited by the options available at the moment. The second thing that affects this is sin, and this is especially where people question this issue. Sin has affected us, and it's affected our ability to choose good. Martin Luther describes it as the bondage of the will, and it's as if we're in a jail cell. Now, imagine yourself in a jail cell. You have freedom to walk around, to use the restroom, to lie down, but you don't have the freedom to let yourself out of the cell. And this is essentially how we're in bondage to sin. We have the free will in our sin to walk around, but we don't have the free will to choose God.